Greetings and welcome back to room 303 of the Harvard Classics. We now will turn to lecture number 35. This is volume number 5, and we are now going to give some introductory comments on Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American transcendentalist. Now obviously that's a term we're going to have to define at some point. Right away, though, as we leave Volume 4 and the Milton poetry, especially Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, we just finished a series of comments on Samson Agonistes, and we turn now to Volume number 5 and the Emerson volume. Immediately we find ourselves engaged in all kinds of interesting speculations about why it is the case that any of the titles were selected for this series, and especially why would Volume number 5 involve the great Emerson, and other questions. When Mortimer Adler in 1952 put together his great book set, no Emerson. Or, for example, this question: how is it possible that the Harvard Classics will have 2 volumes for Darwin, but no Henry David Thoreau, the great young student of Emerson, who would be so influential through his Walden, especially in propagating the ideas of transcendentalism. So it begs the obvious question: why? And even, I mean, think about this. The volume that I'm working with here is 1909. There's your Harvard's Classics. Think about this. There's 27 years between the death of Emerson, and we'll talk more about that one in a second, and the date of this publication in 1909. It's actually the case that the president of Harvard at the time who put together the Harvard Classics, George Eliot, was an acquaintance of Emerson's, and he was 48, George Eliot was, when Emerson died, and he transformed Harvard in many ways, kind of following Emersonian ideas. I'll let you do more research on that. The other thing that we should point out right away is that I have already given lectures on volumes 1 through 4 of the Harvard Classics. You can find that at learnstrong.net. You go down the left-hand side, find where it says Harvard Classics. The other place you can go, because I've already given some introductory comments on Emerson already, is to go down, and when it says Junior English there, you can scroll down and find my comments that I've already given to you on Emerson. What I want to do now, very quickly, is I just want to set up our study and our comments that are coming. We're going to do some introductions to Emerson's biography. We're going to outline those, and then get on into our lectures and into our study. We will take a study approach of Emerson that I want to outline as well here. And of course I want to talk, continuing to talk about the ideas of our learning theory and our reading strategy as well. It seems to me, a couple of stories right away that capture my own thinking about Emerson. One of those is a much often repeated story. That Emerson, when he was a preacher, and we'll get more to his biography in a little bit, but when he was a preacher, apparently he was in a building where he was in a Bible study, and they were engaged in discourse about all things Christian and theological. And right outside of that building, right next to that structure, was a slave auction going on. And Emerson, who was a great journalist writing in journals, he actually writes about how there was a spiritual disequilibrium that was in play, as here he is trying to talk about principles of Christian theology, and he can hear the quote, "Going gentleman gone," speaking about the selling of a human being. There's so much in that story that's going to inform much about what we'll have to say about Emerson. The other story, and this one's a strange one as well, when his first wife died, we'll have more to say about her later too, apparently 3 years after she was entombed, he had her body dug up so that he could see her one last time because he missed her so badly. Now, while that's a kind of really strange and grotesque idea, standing behind it, I think, speaks volumes about what Emerson was like as a person, a profoundly passionate human being, a lover, if you will. And we'll have obviously more to say about that as well. I think that it's significant, though, to start with some biographic information. Think about this, and let's just do some quick biography for your notes. 1803 is when Emerson is born, actually May the 25th, 1803. Think about your dates. 1803 is when he's born. 1776, the Declaration of Independence. You have 17 years between the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of Emerson in Boston in 1803. That helps place us, if you will. Let's do a quick bit of biography here. Important events is what I'm wanting to highlight here. About most of these dates, I'm going to come back to them in my comments going forward. 1811, his father dies, he's only 8. 1817 to 1821, he ends up as a student at Harvard. There's been much debate about why he wasn't a more successful student at Harvard. Some people have claimed that it's because of his eyesight. He had bad eyes. And in 1820, this is significant for us who study the life of Emerson, he starts keeping journals, and he pretty much does it the rest of his life. And while so much of what we know about Emerson happens through, of course, those famous essays and some poetry that we won't even have presented here, we are going to know that his journals tell us a lot about what's going on behind the scenes. We'll have more to say about this, but Emerson's life is a life which could have easily led some men to be pessimistic and majorly down. And the optimism that we will read in so much of Emerson kind of blows our mind that he was able somehow to rise above it. We'll talk more about it. In 1822, after he gets out of Harvard, he starts teaching school, but he doesn't like it. However, much like what we've said in other lectures about Walt Whitman, who taught school for a while, I don't think that Emerson ever left the notion that fundamentally he was first and foremost a teacher, a sharer of ideas, a communicator of ideas. After 1822, he actually loses vision in one of his eyes for about a month. His bad eyesight would always be a problem for him. 1826, he goes back, Harvard Divinity School, and there he's ordained to preach. He becomes the junior pastor at the 2nd Street Church in Boston, the Unitarian Church, as opposed to Trinitarian. In other words, Emerson will share that deistic idea that instead of there being an understanding of 3 divinities and 1 in the Trinity, rather there is this Unitarian theology. We'll have more to say about that, and you obviously can do your own research as well. 1829, he marries Ellen Tucker. She dies tragically in 1831 of tuberculosis. People who study the life of Emerson try and pick a single year when so much important happens for him. You could make the argument that 1831 is one of those important years when the loss of his life is huge. The loss of his wife is huge. As we've said, 3 years later, he digs up her body to see her one last time. That's how close he was to her. She dies of tuberculosis, 1831. 1832, this is interesting, 1832, right after the death of his wife, he resigns his position as preacher because he decides that he can no longer feel comfortable sharing even that liberal Unitarian Christian theology that he is beginning to share. And then he immediately goes on a journey, and he leaves America, and he goes to Italy, he goes to France, he goes to England, he goes to Scotland, and he does, these trips are important in the life biography of Emerson. I'm only going to emphasize this first trip. There he meets Coleridge and Wordsworth. I've given lectures, obviously, on Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the poetry of Wordsworth. And he also meets Thomas Carlyle, who's going to be a very influential thinker in his life as well. Interestingly, 1835, he will marry Lydia Jackson. He takes a second wife. And it's at this point that his life starts to take off in terms of his philosophy, his transcendental ideas. September of 1836 is a huge year because that's the year that he publishes Nature, and it's also the year that he begins or forms the Transcendental Club, as we call it. 1837, I'll talk more about this in my next lecture, American Scholar is given. 1838, the Divinity School Address is given, and then from that point on, his life really does take off in terms of the work that he does. 1856, he publishes English Traits. This is the last text in this volume number 5, which is why I'm pointing it out here. In 1871, for those of us that live out west here, you'd be happy to know, he travels to Salt Lake City and on to Yosemite, and I think that's significant as well because it says that Emerson was a man who wanted to understand and know all of America, not just the East Coast. 1882, April the 27th, at the age of 79, he dies of pneumonia. And it's that life now that we want to turn to in terms of our study and how we're going to approach our study. Scholars are always divided about how actually to approach the study of Emerson. What's the best way to do it? Do you just start with his biography and work forward? Do you go to the texts that are most famous and you work from that going backwards and some of the ideas? The approach that I'm going to take, an integralist approach, this won't shock you, we did the same thing in our study of Milton, is to say, I want to see at least 3 Emersons. I think there's easily way more than this. But I think for our study, it makes sense for us to look at least 3 different Emersons. And as we look at then the essays that are presented in the Harvard Classics volume, not all of them, only a handful of them, we want to ask about, first of all, Emerson as teacher. This is the personal biographic information. This is the how did he understand his life through the suffering of his life, the physical suffering, the mental and the spiritual suffering and torture of his life. But I think Emerson always saw himself as a teacher, and he became an outstanding lecturer. The essays that we will read, many of them start out as speeches that will be given, and there's a dynamism that we'll talk more about in a moment. I think beyond Emerson as teacher, we want to understand in our second perspective as Emerson as philosopher. Okay? He's not just a teacher, but he's also a philosopher. He's very interested in the questions of philosophy, the questions that we've raised already in our earlier lectures in the Harvard Classics series all up to this point. He loves the philosophy of Plato, and of course he's very aware of the role of Socrates within the Athenian culture. Of course, he knows his Milton, and he has unbelievable respect for Shakespeare and Milton. Some have argued he deifies almost these two guys, and making Milton, of course, such an important figure in the life understanding of Emerson takes us to Milton's project of theodicy, no question. That's going to be a big one. The idea of transcendentalism. Emerson himself didn't actually like the term transcendental very much. We'll obviously define that term in more detail as we go forward, but he liked the idea of idealism, very influenced, as we said, by Plato, very influenced by the idealism of Immanuel Kant. We'll have more to say about that as we work through some of these lectures. In earlier lectures for the Harvard Classics, you'll recall that I made that observation from Plato's theory of the forms, that you have got the kind of dualism that's in play, where in the first box, above the word images, above the box, the word images, in the first box we have those things related to the 5 senses, you'll recall. And then of course in the second box we have those ideas or those concepts. For example, we can talk about a beautiful woman or a beautiful man or a beautiful body in the first box. Because you can see it, you can taste it, you can touch it, we won't get into it. But in the second box we're going to have a concept like beauty, right? And of course a concept like beauty is not physical, but what we would call metaphysical. Meta, of course, here meaning beyond. Transcendentalism simply means the idea of going beyond the first box, the things that are related to the physical, and going to something beyond, that is to say, ideas or concepts, which is why, again, as a philosophic system, we talk about it as idealism often more than we talk about it as transcendentalism, right? Of course, a part of this philosophic view as well is the unbelievable emphasis on individualism that's so important to our reading of Emerson. When we think about Emerson as giving birth into an American kind of idea of philosophy, of how one should live one's life, played out, of course, especially in the life of his great friend Henry David Thoreau, we're talking again about the philosophic Emerson. So if we're going to see Emerson as teacher, and we're going to see him as philosopher, thinker, we're going to also see him as artist. We don't want to overlook this. It's very important that I say this out loud. Emerson's prose is as beautiful a prose as you're ever going to read, and I'm going to hope that I can kind of translate that onto you. In my comments on Milton, for example, I was always talking about how I wish that I could just read the entire poem to you, but it's too long. I'm going to say the same thing every time I meet one of these essays. I'm going to say, I wish I had the time to just sit and actually read American Scholar word for word with you, and we could exegete as we go. I'm not going to have the time to do that, but I hope that my comments will motivate you to pick up the text and read it on your own. And I'm going to challenge you, in fact, to read it out loud. Maybe read it out loud to some of your pals and take turns reading it. Fall in love with the artistic Emerson. He, of course, is a great writer. Now, we're going to spend time at 2B. We'll mention those levels of reading in a second, but at 2B, asking not so much what Emerson says, but how Emerson says it. We'll be interested in the symbolism, we'll be interested in the metaphors and the figurative language that he's always employing. So what are we really about in our Harvard Classics study? Well, I've said it before, I'll now reemphasize it. We're always about learning. What do we define learning as? The capacity or the willingness or the daringness to connect new information to old information. So for example, even within just the lectures of the Harvard Classics up to this lecture, can we, about any idea that we meet of Emerson's, ask, well, how does that relate to things that we've already learned in prior study and in prior lectures? And I'm going to hope that I can help you to do that, that connecting. Remember, we've said this out loud. This ability to connect, to gain, to derive meaning from the stuff that we're studying Each of us does that in our own way, to sound kind of like Emerson, in our own unique way. And I want to empower you to be able to do that for yourself. Now, of course, we're always working in 303 with levels of reading, so let's review that really quickly for those of us who are just joining this lecture for the very first time. When we pick up a text and we take a look at it, we always want to be reading at least 3 levels. Level 1, what does the text say? Here we're just looking to summarize briefly. Level 2, what does the text mean? Here we will subdivide between 2A, major themes, messages, ideas, and 2B, rhetoric, right? Not what Emerson says, but how Emerson says it. And that rhetorical component I was just mentioning will be huge for us at 2B. Finally, at level 3, if we're asking what does the text say, what does the text mean? At level 3, how do we relate to the text? This is fundamental to understanding learning in 303, right? And we divide again at level 3. 3A, how do I relate this text to other texts I know about and to the world and the experiences that I live in? And then finally at 3B, and most importantly, how do I relate this to myself? How can I find an idea that works for me? And can I adopt an idea and grapple with it for a while and decide whether I agree or disagree with it? If learning happens at all for you, and I hope that it does through these lectures, it happens at that level 3B, where we're asking ourselves to somehow try to relate, to somehow understand an idea or a concept. We don't have to agree with it, right? We don't have to agree. In fact, go back to our Milton lectures. There was a lot of stuff that we said that Milton had to say, we didn't agree with, and yet we're grappling with it, we're wrestling with it, we're thinking about it, we're trying to come to terms with it. Now, the selections themselves are not all of Emerson's essays. We'll begin with American Scholar, then we'll go to the Divinity School Address, then Man the Reformer, then we'll look at Self-Reliance, which some have argued is his most important essay. I've given earlier comments on Self-Reliance on learnstrong.net. You can go and take a look at that. Then we'll look at his essay Compensation, then Friendship and Heroism, then we'll meet The Oversoul, which is one of those really important essays about the transcendental Milton. Circles will take us there as well. The Poet will be a fascinating essay that will give birth to, some have argued, the very creation that was Walt Whitman and his Leaves of Grass of 1855. Remember, in an earlier lecture, we pointed out that Emerson congratulated Whitman on the beginning of a great and new career, and Whitman was pretty politic about the way he used that letter. Then we'll go to Character, then Manners, then Gifts. Then we'll meet an essay called Nature, which is a second time that he used that title for an essay or a piece of writing about nature. Politics, New England Reformers, Worship, and then the last essay that we'll mess with here is Beauty. And then the second part of this volume will be his English traits, written as he was traveling in England. That's a fascinating study as well. What's not here, that important essay that he wrote first called Nature. I've mentioned it in an earlier lecture, and that one will be for us a really important, and I'll mention it maybe later when we get into some other lectures. None of Emerson's poetry is here in Volume 5. None of the journals selections are here in Volume 5. You can run that stuff down elsewhere, online especially, right? Finally now, we will turn to the essays themselves. Again, my hope is that I can share with you the beauty of Milton's prose. I can share with you the philosophic challenges of his idealism and his transcendental philosophy. And I can share with you as well this amazing life that he lived as teacher, as father, as husband twice, and the compelling life story that is Emerson's. One of the things that we're gonna point out again and again from Emerson's biography is the pain of the suffering. He lost losing his son Waldo, and as we've said, his first wife. And yet, rooted through all of that is this unbelievable optimism that he keeps sharing. Americans and America will adopt that idealism, will adopt that self-confidence, that notion of he who would be a man must be a nonconformist from Self-Reliance. We'll adopt a lot of that, and America will become America in large part because of the great Ralph Waldo Emerson. We'll turn next in our next lecture number 36, to the first of the essays and lectures that are and deliverers that are provided here. The American Scholar, an essay that will challenge us right away with fundamental questions about what does it mean to be a student? What does it mean to be educated? What does it mean to believe that all people should be properly educated? I welcome you to a series of comments on Ralph Waldo Emerson. I'm excited to be with you now for volume number 5, and I hope that you'll come back to join me. Thank you very much.